Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Glad to be here for this deep dive.
Yeah, we've got a fascinating one today, but to start off, I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you are standing on a freezing street corner.
Oh, man. Setting the scene early.
Right. And the wind is just biting right through this really thin coat you're wearing. Your stomach is gnawing with a hunger that you just can't satisfy. And you are completely, utterly destitute.
That is a bleak picture.
It really is. You're standing there shivering, and you are convinced that you have finally reached the absolute end of the line. So the question is, where do you go when society has completely given up on you?
Yeah.
And, maybe even more terrifyingly, where do you go when you have finally given up on yourself?
It's a profound and, frankly, unsettling image. But that physical, emotional, and spiritual rock bottom is really the baseline reality for the people we're going to be discussing today.
Exactly.
It's a place devoid of almost all conventional hope.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We are looking at men who started in coal bins and prison cells and, end up advising Yale graduates and building these sprawling social empires.
Incredible.
We're looking at a historical study called Miracles of Rescue. It's authored by Dr. William E. Paul. And our mission today is to try and figure out this central, really jarring paradox.
Right, the paradox.
Yeah. Like, how did the absolute worst, most blighted environments on Earth somehow produce the most effective leaders and social reformers of their entire era?
The premise itself just challenges almost everything we assume about, leadership development and social mobility.
Oh, totally.
To understand how that happened, we have to look at the unique ecosystem Dr. Paul documented in his sources. He wasn't just, collecting inspiring stories for a sermon.
Right.
He was conducting a rigorous sociological review of what actually happens at the bottom. And he establishes this crucial piece of context right out of the gate.
Which is so interesting, right? Because Dr. Paul himself, who became a highly successful mission superintendent, he never actually experienced this kind of depravity.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
He became a Christian at 14. He lived a life relatively shielded from the gutter.
Yeah, he explicitly points out that sin is not the prerequisite for greatness.
Yeah.
I think he actually writes about wishing everyone could just start on a good path and, skip the suffering entirely.
Exactly.
He isn't romanticizing the gutter at all.
Not in the slightest. He is actively dismantling that pervasive and honestly somewhat dangerous myth that you have to be a massive broken sinner to become a great force for good.
Like you need a dramatic testimony to matter.
Right, that is a fallacy. But he focuses his study on these historical reprobates to prove a different, undeniable point. That rescue missions, as an institution, have served as incredibly fertile recruiting grounds. In proportion to their size, these tiny, underfunded storefronts have recruited a staggeringly disproportionate number of highly capable organizers.
Ministers, reformers.
Yeah. Yes. From the absolute dregs of society. It forces us to ask what it is about the raw magnetic power of that mission environment that reclaims what the rest of the world deemed completely irredeemable.
I keep thinking of this in terms of a deep-sea salvage operation.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. If you look at standard charitable work or even conventional church outreach, it often operates like surface-level fishing. Mm-hmm. You cast a net, you pull in people who are already swimming near the surface, people who understand the social contracts, who know how to sit quietly in a pew.
They know the rules.
Exactly. But these early rescue missions, they were going down into the Marianas Trench of society, the darkest, coldest, highest pressure environments imaginable.
The places where the social gravity just crushes human beings.
Yes. And the people running these missions are going down there specifically to recover treasures that the rest of the world looked at, calculated the risk, and just said, nope.
Too risky.
Yeah. They said, that is lost forever. Leave it at the bottom of the ocean.
The pressure of the deep is a highly accurate way to visualize the crushing, multi-layered reality of 19th and early 20th century poverty.
Because there were no safety nets.
Exactly. We are talking about eras long before modern social safety nets. If you fell into addiction or severe poverty back then, there was no baseline floor to catch you.
You just kept falling.
You just fell. And to perform a salvage operation at those depths requires very specific, incredibly resilient methodologies. A standard approach simply collapses under that kind of pressure.
So I want to look at the actual mechanics of that salvage operation.
Yeah.
Because when you're dealing with men who are freezing, starving, and violently hostile to authority, you can't just walk up and hand them a theological tract.
No, you definitely cannot.
You have to address the physical, bodily reality first. And the history of Jerry McAuley is probably the rawest, grittiest example of this philosophy in action.
Jerry McAuley is arguably the foundational archetype of the rescue mission convert. I mean, you cannot understand the movement without understanding his psychology.
Let's paint the picture of this guy for the listener.
Yeah.
McAuley was what the locals called a river rat.
A river rat, which sounds bad enough.
But for those unfamiliar, a river rat wasn't just a poor person living near the water. These were the toughest, most violent, thieving, carousing men operating on the waterfronts of major cities.
They were essentially maritime gangs.
Yeah, exactly. And Jerry hated everyone. He was consumed by this violent bitterness against a society he felt had discarded him.
Completely walled off.
Right. And on one occasion, a visiting missionary had the sheer audacity to knock on the door of the dreary boarding house on Cherry Street where Jerry was staying.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, Jerry's response wasn't to argue or slam the door. He physically grabbed the missionary and threw him down the stairs.
That is the psychological baseline we're dealing with here. A man completely walled off by hostility, operating purely on the defense mechanisms of survival, territorialism, and rage.
It's intense.
Very. He views any intrusion, especially a religious or charitable one, as an inherent threat, or just a profound insult.
So how do you crack that armor? Well, eventually, Jerry hits his own personal rock bottom. He was completely broke, starving, and standing on the precipice of returning to the river to commit violent crime just to feed himself.
Pure desperation.
Pure desperation. Another missionary manages to track him down, and they go to the Howard mission for a conversation. The missionary quickly assesses the situation and realizes that talking is entirely futile.
Because Jerry is physically starving.
Yes, his body is shutting down. But the missionary checks his pockets and realizes he has absolutely no money. Zero.
Which is a critical failure point in standard charitable work. You identify the need, but you lack the immediate resources to meet it, so you offer platitudes and leave.
But this missionary doesn't offer platitudes. He tells Jerry to wait. He walks out of the building, takes off his own winter coat, goes to a local pawn shop, pawns his coat for 50 cents, and brings the money back to Jerry so the man can eat.
Wow.
Yeah.
The sheer physical vulnerability of that act is what we need to analyze. It represents a concept the historical records refer to as a strange trade. Pawning a coat to redeem a life.
A strange trade. I love that.
The missionary didn't offer a sermon, right? He offered a literal piece of his own survival gear. He walked back into the freezing cold without a coat to prove a point. These early missions operated on a strict law of love.
They bypassed complex theology in favor of immediate, radical sacrifice.
Exactly.
I'm trying to put myself in McAuley's shoes here. If I'm a cynical, violent criminal and someone pawns their coat for me, I'm not suddenly religious. I'm suspicious.
Right. You're looking for the catch.
Yeah, I'm thinking this guy's a sucker, or he has an angle, or he wants something from me. What is the psychological mechanism that actually breaks that suspicion down? Why didn't Jerry just take the 50 cents, laugh at the guy, and go buy booze?
Well, it's because of the asymmetry of the interaction. A man like Jerry McAuley is intimately familiar with transactional violence and transactional relationships. In the underworld, if you give something, you expect something of greater value in return, usually enforced by violence. You hit me, I hit you. You do me a favor, I owe you a brutal debt.
It's all about leverage.
Precisely. If the missionary had preached at him, Jerry's psychological armor would have deflected it perfectly. He would have categorized it as elite condescension.
But the coat.
Radical, self-harming vulnerability. Taking the coat off your own back and walking into the freezing wind for a man who previously threw your colleague down a flight of stairs.
Yeah.
There is no established defense mechanism for that in the criminal underworld. It completely short-circuits his cynicism.
It just breaks the rules of his reality.
It forces Jerry to confront a terrifying reality, that his life actually has value to someone else. And that realization is the mandatory first step to believing his life might have value to God, or even to himself.
That makes so much sense. It shattered his entire worldview in a matter of seconds. And the aftermath of that 50-cent investment is just haunting.
It really is.
The historical accounts say Jerry became sick with remembering.
Sick with remembering.
That phrase alone is so incredibly evocative. He didn't just feel bad. He experienced a visceral physical sickness over the regret of his past violence.
A total system shock.
Yeah. He completely abandons the river. He eventually scrapes together resources and founds the helping hand for men on Water Street. And he becomes this magnetic, unmatched speaker.
But not a polished one?
Right. He isn't speaking with high-minded seminary rhetoric. He speaks river rat. He knows the waterfront slang, at the rhythms of the docks, the specific flavor of despair that these men face.
He had absolute cultural fluency in the language of the gutter. And that is exactly how the rescue mission movement began to scale. Redeemed men like Jerry became the ultimate emissaries.
Because they had the credibility.
Exactly. Jerry's work in that old, dilapidated rookery house on Water Street didn't just save local men. It helps light the fires of evangelism for massive historical figures.
Like who?
Well, men like D.L. Moody and Billy Sunday would later point back to the raw, unfiltered work happening on Water Street as the authentic beating heart of the movement.
Wow.
And every single bit of that subsequent historical impact traces back to one guy deciding to shiver so a violent man could eat a 50-cent meal.
It is the ultimate example of addressing the physical need to unlock the spiritual door. And it brings up this fascinating recurring theme in these historical accounts, the sheer asymmetry of the financial investments versus the sociological returns.
The ROI is wild.
It really is. There is another account that highlights this economics of compassion in a way that almost defies logic. It involves a wealthy couple, Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Whitmore.
The Whitmores represent the other side of the societal coin, right? The Gilded Age elite colliding with the slums.
Right. So they decide to go down and visit the Bowery mission. Now, according to the ledgers, it cost exactly $7.96 to keep the doors of that mission open that particular night.
$7.96.
Just to keep the heat on, the lights burning, and the staff present.
Even adjusting for historical inflation, we are talking about an operational budget that is shockingly meager. It is the definition of a shoestring operation.
But because that specific $7.96 was spent, the doors were open when the Whitmores walked by. They went inside and witnessed the work firsthand.
They saw what was really happening.
Yeah, they saw the cloud of witnesses, the men whose lives were actively being pulled from the wreckage. The juxtaposition of their own comfortable lives against the raw, visceral reality of the Bowery mission fundamentally broke them.
It changed everything for them.
Completely. They cast aside their lives of easy living. That single night's operating cost inspired them to dedicate their considerable resources and influence to the cause.
And they did a lot.
Oh, they went on to found Doors of Hope across the entire country. They organized a massive union of gospel missions. They built entire organizational structures to catch the people falling through the cracks of industrializing America.
We have to analyze the concept of leverage here. In the context of social work and rescue missions, the leverage is astronomical.
Yeah. The physical resources required to keep a door open or provide a single meal are objectively tiny. But the potential energy of a human life is functionally infinite.
I love how you phrase that.
When you invest a minuscule amount of capital to intercept a life at its lowest trajectory, the compounding returns over decades are incalculable. The Whitmores proved that the barrier to profound nationwide social change isn't always a multi-million-dollar endowment.
Sometimes it's just keeping the lights on.
Sometimes the barrier is simply the lack of someone willing to keep the lights on in a dark place for one more night.
I find myself wondering what the modern equivalent of that is. What is our $7 investment today that shifts the entire trajectory of a nation's social fabric?
It's a great question to reflect on.
But this leads us to a really uncomfortable question. We've established that the physical door is open. We've established that the heat is on. But we need to look honestly at who is walking through those doors.
And why they are walking through them. Exactly. If we strip away the romanticized history, the reality is rarely a pretty pious picture of men seeking spiritual enlightenment.
It is almost never a picture of piety. A counterintuitive truth that emerges from these sociological studies is that people in the blighted areas of great cities do not walk into a rescue mission looking for God.
Not at all.
They walk in looking for immediate physical survival. They want a bed, they want soup, they want to get out of the freezing wind. And the absolute brilliance, and perhaps the most controversial aspect of the mission, is that it flatly refuses to judge the motive at the door.
And Fred Becker's the perfect test case for this. On the streets, they called him Bum Vagary.
Quite the nickname.
Right. He was a chronically homeless man who walked into the Union City mission in Minneapolis purely out of selfish survivalist motives.
Purely.
It was freezing outside. He just wanted to use the mission to avoid hypothermia. He had absolutely zero respect for the institution. He wasn't there to listen. He wasn't there to change. He was just there to use their coal heat.
In almost any normal societal institution, if you show up explicitly to use the facility without respecting its rules, its staff, or its intent, you are expelled.
You're out.
Right. A library will kick you out if you just sleep there. A hospital waiting room will eventually remove you. Standard institutions demand a baseline of behavioral compliance and aligned motives.
Which makes me genuinely question the viability of the missions model. Aren't they just asking to be exploited? If you let a guy like Bumbaggery in, knowing he's just using you for heat, aren't you just running a free hotel for cynics?
You'd think so.
But look at how the superintendent handled it. Instead of kicking Becker out or telling him he had to earn his keep or holding his coat hostage until he suffered through a 2-hour sermon, the superintendent greeted him warmly.
Yes.
Gave him a bed for the night, and then he did something that completely short-circuited Becker's brain.
This is my favorite part.
The superintendent walked over and physically tucked the blankets around Becker's shoulders.
The physical act of tucking him in is a masterpiece of psychological intervention.
Because Becker was a man who was used to being put to sleep with rough fists in alleyways or with the crack of a police nightstick. He was conditioned for violence.
Right.
And suddenly, a figure of authority is tucking him in like a child. Is this the underlying mechanism of the movement?
Yeah.
That they simply refuse to demand moral purity as the price of admission?
It is exactly that, and it aligns perfectly with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs long before Maslow ever codified it.
Oh, that's a brilliant connection.
The underlying philosophy is that demanding a pure spiritual motive from a man who is actively freezing to death is not just arrogant, it is a fundamental sociological failure.
It doesn't work.
No. When a human being is hypothermic, their cognitive bandwidth is entirely consumed by the physiological panic for warmth. They literally do not have the brain capacity to process abstract concepts of redemption or morality.
They just need to survive.
The mission provides the physical safety, the warmth, the tucked-in blanket unconditionally. By removing the immediate physiological panic, they create a safe psychological harbor. Only then can the higher-level cognitive functions even begin to turn back on.
And it actually worked, despite Becker's terrible motives. Because the very next night, Bumbaggery came back.
He came back.
He still wasn't fully bought in, right? He strategically sat right by the back door so he could easily escape if things got too preachy. But he stayed in the room. And that night, when the call was made, his cynicism finally cracked.
He finally gave in.
He surrendered his life. This man went from a freezing, cynical vagrant sitting by the exit to a man who eventually became the superintendent of rescue missions in Milwaukee and Memphis. He became an ordained minister.
It's astounding.
All because a superintendent let it in to exploit the heating system without interrogating his motives.
It is a dynamic we can call accidental grace. You enter an environment seeking one specific, often selfish thing, survival, warmth, a free meal, and you inadvertently stumble into a completely different paradigm.
Accidental grace.
You absorb the environment despite your intentions. We see this mechanism pushed to its absolute ethical limit in another historical account involving a man named Jack Bennett.
Now, Jack Bennett's story is terrifying from an operational standpoint. Bennett was a former lawyer who had lost absolutely everything to severe alcoholism.
A massive fall from grace.
Huge. He had fallen so far down the social ladder that he was literally living inside a coal bin in Washington, D.C.
A coal bin.
Covered in soot, drinking whatever he could get his hands on.
Huh.
So he decides to make his way to the Jerry McCauley mission, which was being run by Sam Hadley at the time.
Right.
But Bennett didn't go there for soup or a bed. He went there because word on the street was that Sam Hadley was a soft touch. Bennett went to the mission with the explicit, predatory motive of conning them out of money to feed his addiction.
He walked through the doors as an active threat to the mission's resources. He was looking to exploit their charity to perpetuate his own self-destruction.
This is where I have to pause and look at the sheer risk involved here.
It's massive.
If you run an organization and you knowingly allow predators in men whose stated goal is to drain your resources through deception, how does the mission not just go bankrupt? How do they survive being the target of every con artist in the Bowery?
It is a massive risk. You're totally right. But the missions operated on a calculated gamble regarding the density of their own environment.
What do you mean by density?
They believed that the atmosphere inside the mission, the sheer density of unconditional love, combined with the undeniable lived testimonies of the other men in the room, was stronger than the toxicity any one individual could bring in. It's an ecosystem of redemption. They let the predators in because they believe the ecosystem will neutralize the predatory instinct before the predator can drain the resources.
And that is exactly what happened to Bennett. He walks in, scouting for his opportunity to make the soft touch. But while he is waiting for his moment, he is forced to sit in the hall and listen.
Right.
And he hears the testimonies of the other men. He's a disgraced lawyer, so he understands evidence.
He knows how to weigh facts.
Exactly. And he is sitting there watching men who used to be just like him, men who were completely enslaved by alcohol, men who lived in coal bins and alleyways, standing up clear-eyed, sober, and victorious.
It ruins his con.
He went in to run a con, but the evidence presented by his peers completely dismantled him. He was converted right there. He gave up the alcohol, eventually reunited with his estranged wife, Ada Jean.
Which is a beautiful story in itself.
And they didn't just quietly return to a suburban life. What did they do?
Well, they leveraged his organizational skills, the very skills he used to possess as a lawyer, to build.
They built a massive 7-story Central Union mission in Washington, D.C. This wasn't a tiny storefront. It had dormitories, specialized rehab facilities, and a 200-acre working farm out in the hills to help men detox and build habits of industry.
The scale is just unbelievable.
A man who was living in a coal bin, plotting a petty theft, ended up constructing a 7-story institutional powerhouse. It proves that the accidental grace model, while incredibly risky, yields results that standard vetting procedures would completely miss.
If you put up a barrier demanding pure motives at the door, Jack Bennett dies in a coal bin. The mission acts as a giant, unconditional safety net. It catches the survivalists, the cynics, and the exploiters.
It catches everyone.
But once inside the net, the social pressure flips. On the street, the social pressure is to be violent and selfish. Inside the mission, the social pressure is driven by peers who have found a way out. It is a profound application of positive peer contagion.
Which brings us to one of the most jarring aspects of this history. We've seen how these deeply broken, often hostile men are brought in, but the transformation doesn't stop at them becoming sober, upstanding citizens.
Far from it.
The sheer, almost comical improbability of who ends up becoming the actual spiritual leaders of this era is mind-boggling. These missions weren't just saving men, they were minting generals for their own cause out of the unlikeliest raw material imaginable.
And if we were talking about unlikely recruits, we absolutely have to examine the psychological profile of Charles Langsman.
Oh, Charles Langston. The historical records later referred to him as the Apostle of Love.
Which is deeply ironic.
Bordering on absurd, really, when you look at his resume. Langsman was a violent bartender. He was a professional gambler. He was a bare-knuckle street fighter.
A real tough guy.
He was deeply entrenched in the brutal gang warfare of New York City. He was actually shot twice during gang disputes.
Shot twice?
Yeah. And because the heat was too high in New York, he flees halfway across the country to Chicago. His right leg is severely broken from the violence. He is literally limping through the streets.
Just a broken man.
He goes into a pawn shop and pawns half of the clothes off his back just to afford a cheap pair of crutches. So he is hobbling down a Chicago street in severe pain, half-dressed, and he looks through an open door and sees an empty chair in a mission.
He is a man who operates entirely on physical dominance and territorial violence, now reduced to crippling physical vulnerability.
So he sits down in the chair, and the historical accounts emphasize a crucial detail here. Langsman was a complete spiritual blank slate.
He knew nothing.
Absolutely nothing about churches, theology, or religious protocol. He had never been inside a gospel service in his entire life. So he is sitting there listening to the speaker talk about a savior who can offer a new life.
Right.
And because Langsman doesn't know you are supposed to quietly reflect or raise a hand, his reaction is aggressively direct. He immediately demands out loud to see and talk with Mr. Christ.
He thought it was a guy in the back.
He literally thought it was the name of a guy sitting in the back office who could fix his life.
It is a hilarious misunderstanding, but it reveals the raw, visceral nature of how these men processed information. Langsman wasn't grappling with the nuanced theology of atonement.
No, not at all.
He heard a practical promise of a better life. And with the aggressive transactional directness of a street fighter, he demanded an immediate audience with the man offering the deal.
But the friction of that change is what fascinates me. You don't take a violent gang member who solves every problem with his fists, introduce him to religion, and suddenly he is a passive, gentle soul the next morning.
No, you don't.
How does that energy actually transfer?
It doesn't dissipate, it redirects. The psychological mechanism here is the redirection of extreme loyalty and zealous energy.
Right.
In the gang structures of 19th century New York, loyalty to the group and absolute commitment to the cause were paramount. Langsman possessed immense willpower and dedication. It was just previously applied to violence and gambling.
So he just swaps the focus.
Exactly. When he experienced this conversion, that exact same intense militant energy was simply re-vectored towards saving other men. He didn't lose his aggressive drive, he weaponized it for empathy.
And the irony of his journey is incredible. The man who originally sat down with Langsman in that Chicago mission, the worker who patiently explained who Mr. Christ actually was.
Yeah, what happened to him?
Years later, that specific worker suffered a relapse. He fell away from the mission and went back to the streets.
Oh, wow.
And it was Charles Langsman, the former street fighter with the broken leg, who tracked him down and led him back to the mission.
It perfectly illustrates Dr. Paul's thesis regarding the ecosystem of redemption. The rescued inevitably become the rescuers. The hierarchy is incredibly flat.
No one is above anyone else.
There's no permanent class of saviors and victims. Langsman eventually rose to become the superintendent of the Chicago Bible Rescue Mission. The gang member who pawned his clothes for crutches became a man that university professors would study and label the Apostle of Love.
We see a very similar pivot, a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, with another major figure, Harry Monroe.
Yes, Harry
was a paroled counterfeiter operating out of Detroit. He had made his way to Chicago, and he was standing at a bar, fully intending to completely relapse into his criminal life. He orders a glass of beer. It's sitting right in front of him.
The critical moment.
But as he is standing there, staring at the foam on this untouched beer, a memory hits him. He remembers the unexpectedly kind words a judge had spoken to him during his sentencing.
The psychology of the untouched beer is a powerful focal point. It represents the razor's edge between two completely different lives.
Exactly. That one distant memory of institutional kindness fills him with a sudden, overwhelming dismay about going backwards. He leaves the beer sitting on the bar untouched.
He just walks away.
He walks out the door, rounds the corner, and hears singing coming from the Pacific Garden Mission. He walks inside, hears Colonel Clark speaking, and the counterfeiter's life pivots permanently.
Just like that.
Harry Monroe eventually takes over as the superintendent of that very mission. And what I love about Harry is that he refused to assimilate into traditional, polished religious culture.
He kept his roots.
He didn't go to seminary, and he didn't unlearn his street slang. He would stand in these massive pulpits projecting this booming voice, and he would yell out to the crowd, "Where did these men come from? They come from their various rendezvous."
These men.
He used the broken grammar and the specific vocabulary of the criminal underworld to preach.
And that raises a critical analytical question, right? Why were men like Langsman and Monroe so vastly more effective at reaching the destitute than highly educated theologians?
Yeah, why were they?
If we look at the broader context of religious history, these men lacked every single traditional qualification for leadership. They had zero formal education, no seminary training, and terrible public speaking mechanics.
But they had something else.
But what they possessed was visceral, undeniable, lived authority.
They were the evidence.
Precisely. When a man in the audience who is actively shivering, detoxing, and deeply suspicious of society looks up at the pulpit and sees Harry Monroe, he doesn't see a theoretical academic pontificating about morality.
He sees himself.
He sees a paroled counterfeiter who understands exactly what a jail cell smells like, who knows the precise temptation of a glass of beer, and who has demonstrably beaten the very demons the audience member is currently fighting. The shared trauma creates an instantaneous bridge of trust that a seminary degree can never replicate.
The historical texts use this beautiful, haunting metaphor. They compare the blighted, desperate areas of modern cities to the biblical pools of Siloam.
The pools of Siloam.
These ancient gathering places where a great crew of impotent, broken, and desperate people would congregate, hoping for a miracle. The modern rescue mission intentionally positions itself right beside these pools of despair.
They go right to the edge.
And men like Langsman and Monroe stand there as living, breathing proof that the day of miracles is not past. They literally turned the most hopeless places on earth into elite training grounds for leaders.
They recognized that the gutter wasn't just a place of death, it was a crucible. The intense pressure of that environment either destroys a person completely or it forges a level of resilience that traditional society cannot comprehend.
So what happens when you take these unlikely recruits, these men forged in the crucible of the gutter, and unleash them back into the world?
Oh, they don't hold back.
Because these guys don't just get sober and quietly sit in a pew on Sundays. They don't just assimilate into a quiet suburban life. They go out and achieve these almost superhuman feats of physical endurance and logistical outreach.
The immense energy and obsessive drive that was previously consumed by their vices and their daily struggle for survival on the streets is suddenly liberated, and they redirect that raw kinetic energy into a singular obsessive mission to reach others.
And nobody, absolutely nobody, illustrates this superhuman drive better than the legend of Fred W. Haywire Davis.
Haywire Davis.
The logistical statistics of this man's life are just absurd.
Let's break down exactly what he did. So, Davis starts out as a traditional student, but he gets expelled from a prestigious New England seminary in absolute disgrace.
They threw him out.
They essentially deem him unfit for ministry and kick him out. So, entirely rejected by the institutional establishment, he heads out into the raw wilderness. And over the course of his life, this disgraced, rejected student traveled 1.5 million miles.
We need to pause and contextualize that number. 1.5 million miles. That is the equivalent of traveling to the moon and back 3 times.
It's unbelievable.
And he was doing this in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Right. He wasn't racking up frequent flyer miles in first class. The records show he was traveling through the harshest environments in North America by dog sled, on snowshoes, and in canoes.
The physical toll that must have taken.
Imagine the sheer, grueling physical stamina required to survive decades of sub-zero temperatures, navigating frozen rivers, constantly facing exposure and starvation. And he wasn't traveling light. He personally distributed 30 tons of Bibles.
30 tons.
The historical ledgers compute that to roughly 2 million individual portions of Scripture.
The logistics of moving 30 tons of physical material through the wilderness via dog sled and canoe is staggering. It requires the logistical mind of a military general combined with the physical endurance of an elite athlete.
And he went to the extremes of human elevation to do it. He would travel down into silver mines, preaching to the miners 2,000 feet underground in the pitch black and the toxic dust. And then he would turn around and climb up to remote mountain logging camps, sitting 8,000 feet above sea level. By hand, he personally built 10 Presbyterian churches, 8 interdenominational chapels, and organized 91 Sunday schools in places where no infrastructure existed.
It begs the question, how did a man whom the traditional seminary deemed a complete failure manage to outproduce entire denominations?
It's the ultimate vindication. And it leads to the most poetic, satisfying detail of his entire life story.
Oh, this is the best part.
After doing all of this, after achieving more tangible, grueling work in the wilderness than any 10 traditional ministers sitting in comfortable parishes, the National Missions Board took notice.
They couldn't ignore him anymore.
They continually paid his travel expenses to bring him all the way across the continent out of the wilderness, year after year. Why? Just so he could stand up and be the keynote speaker at the very same New England seminary that had once expelled him in disgrace.
It is a phenomenal moment of institutional irony, but it also highlights a severe systemic blindness within traditional institutions.
How's?
The seminary administrators looked at a young Haywire Davis and saw a liability. They saw someone who didn't fit their precise, polished mold, so they expelled him.
Yeah.
The wilderness and the mission field looked at the exact same man, threw him into the crucible, and forged him into an unstoppable logistical juggernaut. It proves that conventional metrics for identifying talent, potential, or leadership are often completely useless when dealing with individuals who operate outside the standard deviations of polite society.
That systemic blindness is exactly what the rescue missions exploited. They scooped up the talent that the institutions threw away. We see that same massive scale of societal impact with a man named Mel Trotter.
Mel Trotter is another giant in this history.
Trotter was a severe alcoholic who eventually founded the City Mission in Grand Rapids, Michigan. But his impact didn't stay localized. When World War I broke out, Trotter recognized a massive logistical opportunity.
Right.
He took his raw rescue mission style of speaking directly into the massive Army training camps. The historical records estimate he personally reached and spoke to 250,000 men.
250,000.
250,000 soldiers preparing for the trenches of Europe heard a former severe alcoholic tell them about survival and redemption.
Trotter also went on to found an entire chain of interconnected rescue missions across the Midwest. He was essentially creating a franchise model of social recovery long before corporate franchising was a standard concept.
And the historical texts note that Trotter's aggressive, unapologetic work deeply influenced one of those famous figures of the era, the legendary evangelist Billy Sunday.
Billy Sunday is a fascinating sociological bridge in this history. He was known for the Sawdust Trail and his massive, highly polished tabernacle campaigns. He was essentially the stadium rock star of early 20th century evangelism.
Yeah, he was huge.
But the historical accounts are very careful to note that Sunday never severed his ties to the gritty roots of the rescue mission movement. Even when he achieved massive national fame, he constantly utilized his platform to demand that the wealthy businessmen in every city he visited use their capital to build rescue missions in the poorest, most blighted sections of their towns.
He didn't just ask for money, though. He actually shared his spotlight, right? He would bring these guys onto his massive stages.
He did. He regularly invited the superintendents of these tiny, gritty rescue missions to step onto his massive crusade platforms and share their raw testimonies with audiences of thousands.
That's incredible.
Sunday understood a crucial dynamic. A highly polished, heavily funded mega campaign runs the risk of feeling corporate and sterile. It needs the raw, visceral, undeniable authenticity of the gutter-level convert to maintain its spiritual gravity.
The contrast makes it real.
The ripple effect here is profound. The tiny, freezing storefront mission with a pawn coat and a $15 piano was actually pumping the lifeblood of authenticity into the massive national religious consciousness.
It's an incredible symbiotic relationship. The big campaigns needed the gritty reality of the missions to prove that the miracles were still happening. This brings us to a deeply psychological theme that runs through all of these historical accounts.
The pull to return.
Yes. We've talked about the ripple effect moving outward, guys like Trotter and Davis traveling thousands of miles. But there's also this profound, almost magnetic pull to return to the roots, to go back to the exact physical locations of their former depravity to bring healing.
The psychological concept of restitution is incredibly strong in these narratives. It isn't just about personal vindication, it's about a deep-seated need to balance the cosmic scales. They feel a compulsion to dismantle the very traps that previously held them.
The prime historical example of this is John Callahan, who eventually became known by the incredible title, the Bishop of the Bowery.
The Bishop of the Bowery.
Callahan's early life is bleak. He grew up as a street waif, an unhoused newsboy, and a bootblack. His entire developmental psychology was shaped by the brutal laws of street survival. Inevitably, that survivalist mentality led to criminality, and he was incarcerated in the infamous Tombs prison in New York City.
The Tombs was notorious for its squalor and despair.
After he gets out, he experiences his conversion, cleans up, and eventually works his way up to become the superintendent of Hadley Hall. But he doesn't just leave his prison past behind as a shameful secret. He actively returns to the Tombs. But this time, he walks back in as the official prison chaplain.
He voluntarily re-enters the architecture of his own trauma.
Yes, and the historical accounts detail his specific, deeply moving strategy. He didn't just stand in a chapel and wait for the inmates. He would physically walk the narrow, dark tiers of the cell block.
Face to face with them.
He would stop at the iron bars of a specific cell, look directly at the inmate sitting in the gloom, and say, "I once occupied this exact cell. The Lord cleaned up my life and set me free." Imagine the sheer psychological impact of that interaction. He isn't a university-trained sociologist who drove in from the comfortable suburbs to study criminality.
No.
He is a man pointing at the rusted cot and saying, "I slept right there. I know exactly how cold the floor is. I know exactly the terror you are feeling, and I am telling you there's a way out."
It is the ultimate weaponization of lived experience. It shatters the inmate's excuse that nobody understands what I'm going through. If we contrast Callahan's gritty, street-level restitution with another historical figure, John MacDonald, we see the sheer wild diversity of the trajectories these missions launched.
MacDonald's story is fascinating because his path is almost corporate in its rapid ascent. MacDonald's story starts with a sentimental image, a Scottish mother's framed motto hanging in a vine-covered cottage, quoting Psalm 37.4.
A very idyllic background.
But despite that idyllic background, MacDonald's life derails, and he ends up locked in a jail cell. However, following his interaction with the rescue missions and his subsequent conversion, his trajectory shoots upward in a completely different direction than Callahan's.
He doesn't return to the cell blocks, he infiltrates the boardrooms.
Exactly. MacDonald gets out of jail and secures a job in manufacturing. He proves to be incredibly capable and gets promoted to the assistant superintendent of a Christian union. He then writes a highly influential book titled The Repair Shop for Human Lives.
Quite the title.
And eventually he is tasked with running a highly unique mission operation in New Haven, Connecticut. Now, the wild part about this specific mission is its governance structure. It is governed by a board of directors that consists entirely of Yale University graduates and prominent, wealthy businessmen.
It's such a shift.
So you have a dynamic where a man who literally started his journey sitting in a jail cell is now the chief executive, directly advising a board of Ivy League elites on the logistics and sociology of saving human lives.
It perfectly illustrates the paradoxical nature of the rescue mission ecosystem. The bottom acts as an ultimate equalizer, stripping away all societal pretense. But the redemption experience there acts as a slingshot.
The slingshot, I like that.
Yeah. It propelled Callahan horizontally straight back into the cell blocks to pull others out. And it propelled McDonald vertically straight into the boardrooms of Yale to reshape institutional thinking. But the core propulsion mechanism, the unconditional intervention of the mission, was exactly the same.
And lest you think that by the time McDonald is advising Yale, these missions had all become polished, well-funded corporate entities, the historical record gives us the story of Alfred B. Johnson.
This one is so telling.
This story perfectly encapsulates the scrappy, desperate, grassroots nature that defined the movement. Johnson was not a dynamic, young visionary. He was a highly nervous, anxious village blacksmith who was converted very late in his life.
Not your typical founder.
But he felt this overwhelming compulsion to open a mission in Superior, Wisconsin. Now, Superior was a rough town where multiple previous mission attempts had historically failed and shut down due to lack of funding and interest.
He is walking into a geographical location with a documented history of institutional failure, and she's doing it without any traditional qualifications.
And without any capital. Let's look at the actual logistics of his startup. He arrives in Superior with almost zero money. He manages to rent a small, vacant, dilapidated store by putting exactly $5 down as a deposit.
$5.
He begs the local citizens to donate a few stray chairs. Someone takes pity on him and gives him an old, severely beat-up piano valued at maybe $15. He manages to scrounge some discarded songbooks from a local church. And for his text, he only has one single book.
His own personal, worn-out copy of the Bible.
That is it. That is his entire operational budget, his inventory, and his staff. A nervous blacksmith in a $5 room.
A $5 lease and a $15 piano against the crushing weight of a city's despair. It is almost comically inadequate on paper.
On opening night, he unlocks the doors, and exactly 2 stray men wander in from the cold. But the historical text notes something incredible. Half of his audience converted that very first night.
Half his audience.
Now, mathematically, half his audience was literally one single man. But he achieved a 50% conversion rate on opening night with a $5 real estate investment.
The math is humorous, but the sociological implication is profoundly instructive. When you synthesize all of these diverse historical accounts, from the nervous blacksmith in Wisconsin to Lucius Bunyan Compton setting up networks to help unmarried mothers hidden away in the deep mountains, to the quiet, faithful prayers of a woman named Mrs. Jones who spent years relentlessly advocating for a periodical drunkard who eventually became a great mission worker.
All these different threads.
A clear conclusion emerges. The physical infrastructure of a rescue mission is almost entirely irrelevant.
So if it isn't the building, and it isn't the budget, and it clearly isn't the theological pedigree of the staff, what is the actual common denominator that makes it work?
The unifying thread, as Dr. Pohl's historical analysis describes it, is the concept of being everlastingly at it.
Everlastingly at it.
It is the sheer, unyielding persistence of the institution. Their doors are never closed. The services are held every single night of the year, regardless of attendance, regardless of the weather, regardless of the budget.
They just don't stop.
They establish a permanent physical beachhead in the most blighted areas of a city. They stand as lighthouses that simply refuse to turn off. They create leaders out of outcasts, not through brilliant programming, but simply by being consistently present and unconditionally open to whoever walks through the door, no matter how selfish or predatory their initial motive might be.
Everlastingly at it. That is a principle that translates to almost any endeavor.
Well, as we bring this deep dive into Dr. Pohl's historical accounts to a close, let's just take a moment to look at the staggering ground we've covered today.
It's been quite a journey. We started with violent river rats throwing missionaries down flights of stairs and paroled counterfeiters staring at untouched beers in Chicago dive bars. We follow the trajectory of these men as they transformed into chaplains, walking their old prison cell blocks, logisticians preaching in silver mines 2,000 feet underground, and executives advising Yale elites.
And we can't forget John R. McIntyre.
Oh, yes. We even touched on figures like John R. McIntyre, a man whose physical transformation from the gutter was so profound and striking that an artist literally selected him to be the physical model for the Good Shepherd in a massive stained glass window at the Washington Cathedral.
The Good Shepherd himself.
The core takeaway for you, the listener, the undeniable truth buried in these historical ledgers is the sheer exponential potential residing in the very people society has written off entirely. The greatest societal treasures are almost always found at the absolute bottom of the trench.
That is the documented historical reality presented in Dr. Paul's work. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, applying the mechanics of this history to our present moment. These historical rescue missions, the Helping Hand, the Pacific Garden, the Bowery, existed in the blighted physical geographical centers of great cities. They were tangible places where the desperate physically gathered.
You could see them.
You could walk down Water Street, see a man shivering, and make the conscious physical choice to pawn your coat to feed him. Today, however, the landscape of despair has shifted.
It's invisible now.
Profound isolation, addiction, and rock-bottom desperation are often completely invisible. They are hidden behind glowing screens in quiet suburban bedrooms or lost in the endless algorithmic churn of digital echo chambers.
Oh, wow.
If the physical skid row of the 19th century has digitized, where is the modern rescue mission? How do we identify the invisible river rats of today who are drowning in plain sight? And most importantly, how do you pawn a coat for someone whose despair you cannot even see?
That is a haunting and entirely necessary question to leave off on. The geography has changed, but the pressure of the deep remains exactly the same. How do we build a safety net for the invisible bottom? Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive journey through the history of rescue missions and for taking this deep dive with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep looking for the hidden potential in the places and the people that everyone else has abandoned.